Don't let it scare you too much. Okay, so what I'm going to be talking about is fringe archaeology tonight, what I call fringe archaeology. And what I'm going to get rid of my own picture up here, if you don't mind. With luck. I'm going to define fringe archaeology for you in a little more detail in a couple of minutes, but in a general sense, it's the willingness on the part of many people to accept explanations about the past that just don't match the realities that archaeologists see on the ground, or in the ground, or in our labs, or which our discipline has spent about 150 years working hard to explain. In a lot of ways, the fringe reflects what we see going around us in American society right now. A mistrust of science, a decline in both natural and social science education, conspiracy theorizing run amok, and lots of contentious and disruptive political, religious, and social agendas. As with many other problems we face in American society these days, the rapid spread of fringe archaeology claims has been accelerated because of the web and social media especially. The things I see now on social media about these fringe claims just blows me away most of the time. I had started an article about 5 years ago on pseudoarcheology, which is this basic topic, and it got dated so quickly I never published the thing because it was just out of date the minute some new website came on or some new podcast came on. At the same time, all of this can be kind of amusing, which I've tried to weave into the talk tonight. I'll discuss fringe archaeology topics using examples from my own experiences, many of which are part of claims about Viking runestones in Oklahoma and elsewhere, which is the primary example I will be using. For me, the real curiosity in fringe archaeology, though, is seeing how people create their own pasts and how they use them. Just getting to the spirit of things, let's go back and look at that example from the humorous side, which is one of my favorites, which came out when I was at the University of South Dakota. This article appeared in Weekly World News. I'm not sure if many of you know that tabloid. It was one of the ones you used to be able to find in supermarket checkout racks. You won't be able to read the whole article that I'll show you in a second, but you'll get the point. The front page here claimed that an archaeologist had found Satan's corpse near South Dakota's little town of White River, west of the Missouri River, killed by Sioux warriors in the 1690s. The article named and pictured an archaeologist nobody knew, but like the stereotypic male archaeologist, he at least had a beard. They called him a biblical archaeology, and I'm not sure why a biblical archaeology would be out in South Dakota. I've never seen one there in my whole career. But I would have to ask, can anybody take this stuff seriously? Well, apparently some folks did take it seriously enough to use it as filler in the state's largest paper, the Sioux Falls Argus-Leader. A reporter called me from that paper to ask what I thought of the story. I pretty nastily responded to him. I think you're an idiot for even calling me about it. According to the story, no one in White River really believed that the devil had been unearthed near their town and took it all in stride, but the local druggist did say they bought up all the copies in town. And then he joked, yeah, but a few people have seen Elvis Presley driving a John Deere tractor around here. Of course, maybe the reason they didn't believe it was because the Weekly World News had reported a couple of years earlier that Satan's skull had already been found in New Mexico, with Bible experts calling it the find of the century. This is the kind of silliness I usually call fringe archaeology, but archaeologists use a variety of terms. I've come to think of the terms as moving from not particularly serious to potentially dangerous, else I'll be going through them in a minute. I also use the phrase pseudoarcheology here when the claim sounds kind of sciencey. Pseudo means false, of course, and so combined with archaeology, it sometimes tries to mimic scientific archaeology without understanding the rules of science as used by archaeologists. In one sense, all fringe archaeology is pseudoarcheology. Outsider archaeology usually comes from folks who aren't trained in archaeology, but whose motives are mostly honest. They're making an effort to learn and understand something about the past. Fantastic archaeology is a claim made about the past that is so outlandish that it is not fantastic in a good way. A more negative term is, well, let's just say wacko. Dubious archaeology contains a claim that is untrustworthy, really doubtful in some way, a very questionable value, or difficult to validate given current knowledge. Cult archaeology involves a charismatic individual or group making fantastic claims, sometimes setting themselves up for public recognition or profit in some way. Sometimes it's directly related to fraudulent archaeology. These days, cable TV programs about pseudoarcheology seem to turn hosts and experts into cult figures. Fraudulent archaeology makes a claim or claims in order to trick others into supporting political, religious, or ideological agendas, but also for just recognition, profit, or to stir the pot in some way. I've been teaching this class since I mentioned that, since it was mentioned in the intro, since about 1975, and at 3 different universities. The title has varied over the years. The logo from the most recent offering of the class in 2014, the online version of it, it's at the right. You can see that it's got a lot of figures of archaeological remains from the past, the Pyramid of Chichen Itza, El Castillo, Tiwanaku Gate, pyramids, and so forth. The reason that I started the class was because the public was so enthralled with Eric von Daniken's book, Chariots of the Gods, back in 1975. And students constantly asked about the evidence he presented. As an archaeologist, I became intrigued by how people go about creating their pasts and what the influences are, especially when those pasts seem to be outside what the evidence shows. Most archaeologists will have to figure out how to deal with that kind of thing, the fringe claims, sometime during their career, because they will face a lot of them. Some respond with amusement, while others show their frustration and react angrily. I must admit to doing both sometimes, but I try to admit mostly amusement, and then get frustrated only when it's really fraudulent archaeology. Mostly, I favor gentle persuasion and non-threatening education as the most effective response, but that doesn't always work. So why do people choose to believe these fringe claims? This gets a little complicated. There can be a lot of reasons. I won't define all of these here. There are probably more. A few are from the perspective of the believer, while others are from the perspective of the person trying to convince someone else to believe a fringe claim, or at least to spend money on it. The Weekly World News story, for example, of Satan's Corpse, is an example of fun for readers, but also attempted deception by the publisher to get people to buy his tabloid. In that sense, he was successful, at least in White River, South Dakota. There is one of them that I do want to explain a little bit, and that's the unchallenged received wisdom. Received wisdom is something told to you by people in authority, such as parents, an elder, or at least someone more experienced, maybe a teacher or college professor, a church minister, maybe even a politician or a cable news anchor. Let's give you an example. Think, for an example, about learning about sex in the locker room, where you find educated older people sharing the locker room with you who tell you what's going on with your sex life and what you should expect. Maybe you should even think about what I'm telling you today as some kind of unchallenged received wisdom so far. Michael Shermer has a wonderful book about this called Why People Believe Weird Things. And I strongly encourage you to take a look at this if you can. If you can't, he also gives 2 very fun TED Talks. And I would encourage you to look his name up on the TED menus and see what you can find and hear from him. Listen to them both, try to find them in order because one builds on the other somewhat. When it comes to fringe archaeology, it's important that you understand the difference, I think, between truth and validity. Some philosophers of science would probably quibble with my oversimplification here, but I think the concepts are useful. I love this image, which exemplifies the problem with the truth. The only way you can have it is believing you already have it. That's the stuff that's down here on the earth with you. The pointer running right out here, but the good stuff's already out here. The ultimate or the absolute. It's really out there and unreachable for you. Let's take a look at a couple of these things from archaeology and my experiences. This happened early in my career. My secretary called me one day to tell me that an interesting man was coming to my office, and she said, "You're going to love this one." My door was open and an excited middle-aged man in bib overalls and muddy boots walked right in. He didn't even say hi or introduce himself. He opened a white box filled with cotton and pulled an object out of it that looked like this thing over here. This is not the actual object, but something pretty close. And he said, "I found a fossil heart." You can probably recognize what's wrong with this immediately. Of course, fossilization of soft tissue is extraordinarily rare, and real hearts don't look like Valentine hearts, except at maybe the very bottom down here. He said nothing. He put his rock back in the box and stomped out. Now, this is not so serious. It's an example of outsider archaeology and the result of poor science education and maybe some received wisdom. But apparently he wasn't satisfied with my answer as an authority. I can only hope that he found his way to a paleontologist on campus or a biologist. This one's a bit more serious. I got an email from a guy named Bill in 2010 with these images attached. I exchanged quite a few emails with Bill and looked at many pictures like these. He'd been dealing with a man in Missouri and had bought from that guy about 100 chunks of rock, paying about $10 each for them. The man had told him to look carefully at each one of them. When he did, he thought he saw markers that, when lined up correctly, formed bas-relief sculptures. He believed them to be pre-Indian, possibly Greek. Yet in one he saw a classic war-bonneted chief up here. He was seeing what he imagined, but he kindly marked and labeled each of them for me. I discussed the concept of pareidolia with him, but he would never accept my explanation. Like other fraudulent archaeology, this one is harmful. He'd already paid around $1,000 for these rocks, so it would have been difficult for him to admit he was being hoaxed. He'd been subjected to nasty, fraudulent archaeology. And like the fossil heart farmer, he would not accept what I told him. He was certain I didn't know what I was talking about, even though there's good science explaining the phenomenon of pareidolia. So, to explain that, think about this quote you've often heard, seeing is believing. Is seeing really believing? Just in case you don't know what it is, consider that statement and think how powerful that is. But is what you see always real? Think about some of the optical illusions or magic tricks you've seen. They look pretty darn real sometimes. But overly simplified, pareidolia is the phenomenon of seeing patterns within randomness. For humans, we tend to see faces where they aren't. But it's not just faces. We see other things as well. Do you remember the face on Mars and how whole books were written saying that it was evidence of alien life on Mars and perhaps an alien signal to us? Of course, with lower angles, you can see the face on Mars up here. With lower angles down here, you see that it's just an erosional feature, a feature. When the angle of photography and higher resolution came with the later Mars orbiter, it jumps right out at you what it really isn't. And it's not that face on Mars. It's similar to the way we see the man in the moon. Once the face on Mars was debunked, however, we do have a new one, the samurai on Mars. And you can see in the picture the warrior's face here, the samurai, the eye, the nose, and so forth. And it should take you back to those images that the man who was buying the rocks was kind of seeing on his stuff. When people encounter something completely unknown to them, or given all they do know, something that shows up where or when it wasn't expected or just shouldn't be, the first thing they seek is to link it to things or contexts with which they're already familiar. The things or contexts are often based on received wisdom, that is, something they were told by an authority figure. They may speculate wildly at this point, even to the point of believing or inventing a conspiracy theory. But they tend to see what they want to see. Unfortunately, many of them are reluctant to ask difficult questions or to seek additional information. Many accept their own conclusions or that of some authority as the truth. Mostly this seems harmless, but sometimes unscrupulous people or groups can exploit those tendencies to support their current agendas. The truth is out there, as you can see on the one shirt in the center of this man in the cartoon, or I want to believe, the poster up here on the upper left, are sayings you may recognize from the X-Files, with Mulder being the believer and Scully being the skeptical scientist. Validity, on the other hand, is a matter of how well an evidence-based argument meets the requirements of the system of logic within which it operates. Validity insists on asking questions and challenges all received wisdom. Validity requires ongoing systematic examination, observation, data gathering, explanation, and review in order to reject earlier hypotheses that were proposed. The goal is to either replace bad hypotheses or to fix flaws and clarify arguments. The longer an hypothesis can withstand re-examination, the closer to truth it is thought to be. Even then, however, it remains as a statement of probability or feasibility. Thus, absolute truths are in our heads, so we accept answers that satisfy us only until something better comes along. Truth can be easily satisfied. Validity is never really satisfied. Archaeology is a very cautious science and seeks validity, not truth. As with other sciences, archaeology always uncovers new data and recognizes that new discoveries are likely to prove old hypotheses and explanations are weak or wrong in some way. New studies are subjected to intense scrutiny in the peer review process and require a substantial quantity of high-quality evidence. Peer review is a process, if you don't know about it, in which papers are sent to other experts on a subject. The process is usually double-blind, as it's called, in which the reviewers don't know the name of the author, and the author doesn't know the name of the reviewer. Archaeology, truthfully, is not as rigorous as some of the other sciences, but reviews can still be scathing, even devastating when you get them. I think most archaeologists who've been around a while have had some of those kinds of reviews of their work, including me. The most useful reviews suggest other possibilities for examining data, or different hypotheses, and other ways to make the process better. Still, the process isn't perfect, and it's subject to familiar human foibles such as competitiveness or envy and even laziness. Sometimes the bad stuff slips through the peer review cracks, and sometimes really good work is rejected. Eventually, however, most such matters are found out. Peer review makes disciplines seem slow to change, or sometimes makes them seem unwilling to pursue certain lines of research, all of which frustrates fringe archaeology believers. Or not understanding the process led one pseudo-archaeologist, Scott Walter of America Unearthed, to call archaeology just an opinion-driven discipline. Okay, let's take a little archaeological thinking break here and we'll go from there. How can we assess what might be a fringe claim and what might not be? Here are some questions to ask. Who's making the claims? What are their credentials? Does the person have the necessary training or knowledge to make such an assessment? Barry Fell was a marine biologist from Harvard who did ancient languages as a hobby, for example. He calls himself a forensic geologist, and his company did testing of concrete. Calls him Scott Walter. Has an undergraduate degree in engineering and calls himself a forensic geologist. And his company did testing of concrete in places like parking ramps, bridges, highways, and the like. How does being a marine biologist, a forensic geologist, compare to being a professional archaeologist? I will credit Scott Walter with not calling himself an archaeologist, which is different from some cable TV program hosts. What's the context of the discoveries? Where precisely was an object found and in what situation? What is its relationship to other objects? This is why archaeologists are so slow during excavations and why they map everything. Contexts are as important as objects. Look around you in the room you're watching this from. What might be the relationships between objects you see? And what might they tell you about each object on its own versus what it will tell you in relationship to the other objects? And you'll find out that most objects that we use in life do have some other things that relate directly to them and help you understand and use them more efficiently. This particular issue is common to lots of fringe archaeology claims. Are simpler explanations than diffusion, example from distant places or planets? Are there simpler ones? What would it take to get Romans to the falls of the Ohio, as I'll talk about in a couple of minutes? And why would they bother to carry Roman coins with them? As for interplanetary contact, the odds are incredibly small, and hardly anyone ever considers that such distant travelers, such as Romans or aliens, probably wanted to get back home eventually. And what kinds of objects would they be likely to carry with them if they did come? This is Occam's razor. And Occam's razor is something that you probably know about or have heard about. Even Lisa Simpson on The Simpsons heard about it in one of the episodes and talked about it. But it's one of the most powerful tools in a critical thinker's toolkit. It states that the most likely explanation for an event or phenomenon is usually the simplest explanation. The image shows a figure thinking about how to explain getting from A to B. Both explanations actually work, but the one on the right doesn't involve spacecraft and fire like the one on the left. The caption is another straightforward definition of Occam's razor. When faced with two equally good hypotheses, always choose the simpler. But let's look at how this plays out in Oklahoma. Did you know that spiral mounds and all the stuff in the site were created by giants? Using biblical references to explain who made mounds and other earthworks the colonizers saw when they got to North America east of the Rockies has a long history in fringe archaeology. Using text from Genesis chapter 6, verse 4, there were giants in the earth in those days, and that's become a real hit on fringe archaeology cable TV, podcast, and blog sites, including an America Unearthed episode in which the host, Scott Walter, right here, looked at the discovery of an 8'6" skeleton in Minnesota. The farmer who had them on his land supposedly claimed that they'd been taken away by the state archaeologists. And that's a kind of common conspiracy notion. They're taken away. Supposedly the Smithsonian has them locked up someplace. I always kind of wonder if maybe it's that big warehouse where the Ark of the Covenant was hidden at the end of Raiders of the Lost Ark. The doctored photo up here was made in 2004 in India. And it was a hoax that was picked up by giant believers and is still making the rounds on the internet. And just in case you stumble onto the name of Fritz Zimmerman, he is one of the big names in ancient giant claims. I assure you he is not one of my relatives. Decades of archaeology have shown that the giants had nothing to do with spiral mounds or any of the others in Oklahoma or anyplace else. Spiral mounds were occupied from about 800 AD to about 1450. The site has 12 mounds in village areas for both elite residents and those who supported them. The site was both a ceremonial and trade center. Artifacts recovered from the site, such as the ones that are pictured here, were exquisitely made from shell, pottery, and stone. People of Spiral are believed to have been Caddo speakers, much like the Wichita, Katai, Caddo, Pawnee, and Arikara. Has archaeology answered all the questions about spiral mounds? No, and by definition, archaeology can't do that. There are always more questions and better answers, but no evidence of giants has ever been discovered, at least to my knowledge. Then there's the problem of hoaxes. Hoaxes really thrive from about 1800 onwards. In the US, one of the big ones was the Cardiff giant that was sculpted mostly to make money, but also to take advantage of the belief that North Americans had a deep Judeo-Christian biblical heritage. From 1866 to 68, George Hill of Binghamton, New York, contemplated how to pull off a hoax. It seems that many an evangelist at the time had been preaching that there were giants in the earth. In June of 1868, Hull bought a huge piece of gypsum from Iowa to sculpt. The giant went on exhibition and drew huge crowds. The petrified 10-foot 4-inch giant made lots of money, so much that P.T. Barnum and his partner David Hannum tried to buy it. You can see in the picture on the left that one of their things for the Cardiff giant is P.T. Barnum offered $150,000 for the giant. When the hoaxers wouldn't sell, Barnum and Hannum made their own, which also made a lot of money and actually led to Hannum's famous statement, often misattributed to Barnum, which is there's a sucker born every minute. And that, unfortunately, is the problem with a lot of fringe archaeology claims. As for other hoaxes, the Grave Creek stone was discovered in 1838 during the excavation of the Grave Creek Mound in Moundville, West Virginia, on the Ohio River, about 10 miles south of Wheeling. Cult archaeologist Barry Fell, who I mentioned already, said the inscription was Iberian, but he couldn't translate it. People have made dozens of such discoveries, and the vast majority of them have been documented as hoaxes. The Bat Creek stone on the left was discovered in 1885 during a Smithsonian archaeological dig in Tennessee. Claimed as Paleo-Hebrew or Cherokee, the writing supposedly dates to 135 AD. Scott Walter did an America Unearthed episode about it. I've seen the stone. A good friend of mine is now a curator at the McClung Museum on the University of Tennessee campus, which has the stone. My friend was part of the video for Walter, and he said he was astounded at all the leading questions that Walter asked him. In 1860, David Wyrick found the Newark Holy Stones, including a stone box with a tablet on it that has the Ten Commandments in Hebrew. It was in a burial mound. Archaeologist Brad Lepper recently did a very thorough debunking of the Newark Holy Stones. One important reason for these hoaxes was to demonstrate that European, or at least Judeo-Christian people, had been in the Americas for a very long time. Speculation was that their arrival was perhaps earlier in the Americas than the Native Americans was, and that the earlier arrivals had been responsible for the mounds and all aspects of advanced civilization that went with them. This idea has been called the mound builder myth, by the way, and it's been written about a lot. Euro-Americans especially have wanted a long, heroic history on the continent. And part of the reason for that was to provide a rationale for taking Indian lands by claiming that God had ordained that Euro-Americans should control all the land between the oceans. Essentially, this is the doctrine of manifest destiny. Although this myth had thoroughly been debunked by the late 1890s during the early years of professional archaeology, there are still survivals of the myth, including hoaxes such as that in Burroughs Cave in Olney, Illinois. This hoax begins not in 20th century Illinois, but in a forgotten kingdom of North Africa, once known as Mauritania, encompassing the equivalent of today's Morocco and parts of Western Algeria. It was governed by King Juba II 2,000 years ago. He and his people stemmed from ancient Caucasian stock, which is not an uncommon origin for some of the things regarding hoaxes. They were called the Mori, who were believed to have migrated from Asia Minor after the fall of Troy. They were thus culturally and racially different from the darker-skinned inhabitants who presently occupy North Africa. The cave was discovered in 1982 by Russell Burroughs. He has found and allegedly sold some 7,000 artifacts. No professional archaeologist has ever been allowed to see the cave or to examine the artifacts directly, which makes the discovery profoundly suspicious as a fraudulent archaeology hoax. This one for both recognition and profit, but still taking advantage of the mound builder myth. By the way, I mentioned the Romans a bit back, and I have some things about them that are of interest to some folks in fringe archaeology. Some people in Indiana and Kentucky, right along the Ohio, think the Romans got to the falls of the Ohio. In 1963, a construction engineer found a small hoard of Roman coins, like the ones in the picture, during bridge construction excavations. Can you think of other ways the coins could have gotten there besides Roman exploration? Try applying Occam's razor to this one. It's not tough. Here's your answer. This lot of real Roman coins is now available, I just checked it the other day, to buy on eBay for $39. All the coins are from about the same time range as the found coins from 1963. People have been collecting and losing Roman coins for decades, which is probably a simpler answer than the Romans coming. And just to ask, why in the world would Romans carry coins with them across the ocean and down the Ohio River? What in the dickens were they going to do with them? These images are just to show you that the Vikings are coming, both in this lecture and elsewhere. A lot of these ideas about fringe archaeology do apply to the Viking runestones in Minnesota, Oklahoma, and around the country, which fit the patterns really well. Hoaxes enter into it, but so do the social context to justify taking Indian land, as well as a way for Scandinavian immigrants to protect their cultural identity and their heritage. In particular, the Scandinavians wanted an heroic heritage as Vikings rather than just plain old Norsemen. By the way, the term Vikings and Norsemen are commonly interchangeable, but there are a few differences that some people mention, in that the Norse tended to be traders, and they did trade over much of Europe and slightly into Western Asia. Vikings were mostly farmers who in slack seasons took up raiding. Some scholars contend that Viking is more of an occupation than a people, so Norsemen could go Viking and do raiding expeditions too. The Viking Age extends from about 800 AD to 1066 AD with William the Conqueror. With competing TV series on the Vikings, movies, comic books, and so forth, the Vikings have become incredibly popular and creating lots of erroneous ideas about who they were and what they did. The image on the left is from a very good article in Atlantic Monthly on diffusion and its growing popularity in America. And it tries to explain the spread of ideas from all parts of the world, for which there is extremely little archaeological evidence until the Age of Exploration, when between 1400s and the early 1600s, and there were lots of people moving around the oceans into different places and colonizing. The image in the center is the cover of a book by Michael and Kathleen Gear, who are actually quite qualified archaeologists and have written a whole series of books, 25 in the series, and this one came out on the people of the Song Trail, which is about the first Viking inhabitants at Lanzo Meadows and some of the other places in the far north. Certainly, there is a lot of decent evidence that the Vikings did arrive before the Age of Exploration with Columbus and so forth in 1492. In 1898 in southwest Minnesota, a Norwegian immigrant farmer, Olaf Oman, who you can see in the center here, discovered, and I put that in quotations, the Kensington Runestone. The controversial runestone is a very heavy piece of hard gray rock. He left as part of a glacial boulder that ended up being carved with runes. Roughly translated, the runes tell a story. 8 Goths and 22 Norwegians on an exploration journey from Finland to the west. We had camped by 2 skerries 1 day north from the stone. We were out to fish one day. After we came home, we found 10 men, red of blood and dead. Ave Maria, save us from evil. We have 10 men by the sea to look after our ships. 14 days travel from this island in the year 1362. The validity of the stone's creation became controversial immediately, but claims made that it proved the Vikings were in Minnesota more than 100 years before Columbus made it to the Caribbean, thus giving the Scandinavians rightful claim to the European discovery of America. Folks have argued back and forth about the stone being a hoax perpetrated by Oman and others. The controversy still hasn't gone away. In 2003, as head of archaeology at the Minnesota Historical Society, I agreed to host a meeting about the runestone. The folks at the Runestone Museum in Alexandria, Minnesota, brought the stone. I'd seen it at the museum a couple of times, but never this close, so I had to get a picture of it, and this not Oman character here is me. The conference was structured around not whether the stone was real or a hoax, but what would be necessary to prove that it was or wasn't. Being no runestone expert, I was asked to present the social context of the stone's discovery, which proved fascinating, actually. Now, seeing all the claims about Vikings in Minnesota, there must have been a steady stream of Vikings coming into North America, into the heartland of the country. One small book, this one you see up here, says that there were more than 40 Viking settlements in adjacent Minnesota and Iowa counties. One drawing in the book, this one in the center, I think you can make it out somewhat, shows the hulls of 8 buried Viking boats tied to one mooring stone, as they are called, one of these giant boulders. You can see it right here, which the author of this book found by dowsing. He knew how he knew these boats were all here wasn't exactly clear. He did no excavations or anything, but dowsing told him where things were. Water witching, that's sometimes called. Which there's so many of these large boulders called mooring stones all over the place. You can kind of see one of the holes here. These supposedly were places where Viking explorers moored their ships. And they appeared all over northwest and north central Minnesota, where there must have been dozens of expeditions, according to what this kind of evidence shows. One problem is that many of the mooring stones and boats were found 40 feet above current water levels, which were about the same 650 years ago as they are right now. One problem is that many of the mooring stones were just fragmentary. They would find the holes in smaller slabs of stone. Another question regarding the boats is, why would they bury the boats at all? Is there a simpler explanation? Of course there is. There were no buried boats. The dowsing was not ground truth, no excavation to see if they were there. As for the mooring stones, work in 1981 by Tom Trow, Minnesota Historical Society, found some answers. As it turns out, the mooring stones were actually not that at all. In this area, there's a lot of big boulders where the glaciers dropped their load when the glaciers melted away. And so these things are sitting out in the fields. And when the immigrants came in the 1800s, they wanted to remove the rocks from their field. They also needed stone for building, especially for foundations and steps. In fact, the runestone was found as a step into a corn crib. Being too busy for easy moving, the farmers often broke them up. When they were big enough, they couldn't just be hauled away. So they broke them up by first chiseling or drilling a hole in them, like the one here, and the one here, and the one up there. And the hole is about 1.5 feet long. They inserted a stick of dynamite or black powder and blasted the rock. The result was often stone slabs that could then be trimmed for building. The images show that the hole looked what the hole looked like in one case, and then what it looked like when the charge was misplaced and cracked the rock. These are actually two stones that were on a farm very near where Oman found the Kensington runestone. In fact, when Trow did the work, he found out that the farmer who was blowing up these rocks actually hired Olaf Oman to help him drill the holes. Trow interviewed the farmer's son, who had actually been a little kid when that was going on. Who did Oman just did all the chisel work and the drill work. Trow doesn't directly say this, the archaeologist doesn't directly say this, but this might have been a way for Oman and others to get the slab from which the runestone was made. Trow's published a very accessible article on this in 1998. It's actually a classic work in Occam's razor and how it works. It gets stranger. This shows a Viking grave of 12 Vikings reported near Spring Grove, Minnesota. Did he discover a dig for them? No, he used dowsing, probably a different man. Dowsing has never been confirmed by any of the scientific studies done about it. Blind testing has demonstrated that it doesn't work. I even tried it on an excavation just for fun by two people on my crew who were dowsing aficionados, they said, and had done dowsing most of their lives. They couldn't even find the foundations that were buried in an area that we'd already documented. The runestones around Heavener, Oklahoma, and LaFleur County are probably the second most known and studied runestones in the United States. As with Kensington, there's some debate about the discovery and the dates on the stones. The earliest written documentation of the runestones is 1923. Runestone scholar Henrik Williams believes the stone was probably carved by a Scandinavian immigrant because of the nature of the runes used. Those kinds of arguments go back and forth between the different scholars. What's the nature of the runes, what time frame of them, and so forth. As with the Minnesota stone, Heavener has a nice museum with a cool gift shop and souvenirs much like the Kensington stone in Alexandria. You have to credit Gloria Farley for her energy in promoting the stone as authentic. She actively documented the stone, as you can see in the picture on the lower left. She was apparently a terrific lobbyist for the stone, although she tried to keep an open mind about its authenticity. Farley, in a book in Plain Sight, it's a self-published book. It's a huge book, both in size and weight, similar to the Kensington Runestone book published by Scott Walter and Richard Nielsen about the Kensington Runestone. By the way, I was given a copy of the book by one of my former students, Francine Locke-Bray, Choctaw citizen who lives in Amherst, not too far from Heavener. Her son, if I recall correctly, the geologist who did some of the work trying to find the cave rumored to be part of the complex at Heavener, and if I recall, none was found. In the book, Farley was not an absolutist, so left room for doubt, but not much. One person she brought in was a cult archaeologist and ancient writing epigrapher, some guy who studies ancient writing, Barry Fell, who I mentioned before, who wrote the books America BC and Saga America, two very popular books making claims and markings left by ancient explorers. He proclaimed the stones as being genuine. the stones are interesting, and it's the same way in Minnesota. Local folklore has a way of becoming local history and other things. Linda Leigh Schuler published a novel, She Who Remembers, in 1988. I remember reading this a long, long time ago and didn't really know about the Heavener Runestones then. I read the book, and it has actually quite a good ethnography of an ancestral Puebloan village. They used to call ancestral Puebloan the Anasazi. The ethnography is not too bad that she uses, but the presence of a Viking warrior coming through the village and impregnating the main character, Kwani, is just a bit much. But Schuler cites an article in her bibliography that is by Farley, and also works the Heavener Runestone and river travel routes, Mississippi to the Arkansas River to Poto, into her story. That's part of it. Jackie Bottoms II, an English major with a Cherokee minor and visiting and Viking enthusiast at Northeastern State, created this website. The website shows some effort to be neutral on dates, validity, and the nature of the evidence. There's an interview with Kathy, I think it's pronounced Kofer, raises the possibility that the Vikings connected to existing native trade networks. Jackie Bottoms uses images that are from the Spiral Mound site to talk about ties to Indians. Trade between Vikings and Indians is implied, but the problem is that there's no evidence that I'm aware of Viking or Norse artifacts from sites in the region. Trade is demonstrated archaeologically by the appearance of non-indigenous items or material culture of the indigenous people, in the material culture of the indigenous people, even during the earliest contacts. For example, there's trade material from the Spanish explorations on the plains, the southeast, and the southwest found in native sites or near native sites. For Vikings, there are only a few pieces in the far north that realistically indicate contact. There are unsubstantiated pieces in the Midwest, but almost all of them are quickly demonstrated to be from something else. For example, the Viking sword in Iowa was really a Knights of Columbus ceremonial sword, and a small Viking halberd axe proved to be part of a tobacco plug. Similarly, the Beardmore relic supposedly found in Canada proved to be purchased and planted as a hoax. Even in painting, the story is originally from oral tradition that suggests that a Choctaw hunting party actually discovered the runestone. And you can see the runes in the back of the image back here with the hunters out in front of it. This is from painting by Sonia Ayers called The Spirits of the Runestone. It was at the Five Civilized Tribes Museum for a while, featuring the show, a competitive art show. The thing is that this was 1830 when it was supposedly found by the Choctaws, a year before the Trail of Tears and in an area west of traditional Choctaw lands. That doesn't mean they couldn't have been there, of course. But this story has now worked its way into truth about the runes, along with a couple of other 19th century stories about who found the runes first. But again, the first documentary evidence is from 1923. The Vikings really did get around in Oklahoma, it seems, as well as Minnesota and Iowa. Dates differ on the Oklahoma stones, but when they were inscribed. Farley says that the Heavener, Poto, Shawnee, and Tulsa runestones all kind of cluster around these dates. You can see that there's a very different date from the Kensington stone in Minnesota. This would mean, if these dates are accurate, this would undercut the claim by Alexandria, Minnesota of being the birthplace of America. But a quick study shows that Viking runestones are claimed from coast to coast of the United States. They're even in Washington State and Arizona. Henrik Williams, a leading rune scholar, suggests that all are from the 1800s into the contemporary period, and most are from areas with immigrant Scandinavian populations of some size. Why won't such controversies go away? Well, for one reason, too many people have too much of their identity wrapped up in whether the stone is real or hoax. The social context of the Kensington stone is relatively clear. The area in which the stone and other claimed Viking and Norse materials were discovered is the most heavily Norwegian settled area in Minnesota and in nearby counties in Iowa and the Dakotas. Hundreds of thousands, literally, of Norwegians came to Minnesota between 1851 and 1920. Many first entered through Chicago, but moved away from that area with its very mixed cultures, fearing that their children would lose their Norwegian identity. The Homestead Act of 1862 gave 160 acres of land to families in exchange for their promise to live on and cultivate the land for at least 5 years. 1862 was also the year of the Dakota War, or Sioux Uprising, as it's sometimes also called. Historian Rhoda Gilman has pointed out that the 1362 date on the runestone is exactly 500 years earlier, so may have been a statement about shifts in land ownership from Dakota people to Euro-Americans. Of course, the Minnesota folks are heavily invested in their football team, including the stereotypic horned helmets of the guy who gets dressed up for every game. In Oklahoma, there was a much less intense Scandinavian influx, but there were similar issues with land claims. Oh, by the way, look over here at this guy. This is Big Ole. Big Ole was a statue made for the 1962-64 World's Fair in New York City to promote the Runestone Museum and to promote Minnesota. And they made this statue in the hope that it would bring tourists to Minnesota. It was not all that successful. In Oklahoma, this less intense influx, there were similar ideas about land claims as well. Of interest is that the translation of the Heavener stone is Glome Dale or Glome's Valley, essentially, as many people have said, an indication of a land claim, according to some. So you're kind of divided into two parts here. From these three books to the left are about the Kensington runestone, and these on the right are all about the Heavener runestone and the associated runestones. Books on the left, this one is actually a very good history of the runestone and the controversies about it. It's a nonfiction book. This is a novel. It's sort of a Western adventure story. This is a comic that was also made for that World's Fair to sell up there about the mystery of the runestone. On the right, though, you have the ones from Heavener. For example, this is Peggy Chambers, who is an Enid, Oklahoma author. She describes her two young adult novels as Peter Pan type fantasies. This thing is called The Cowboys, Masons, and Vikings. It's a DVD with one of the runestone runes on the cover of the DVD. It's about, as the jacket describes it, quote, a redneck archaeologist, Jackson Burns, takes a dangerous 5-year trek into finding the truth about the mystery of the Oklahoma runestones, where he is confronted by mysterious men on ATVs, pickups, and airplanes, and chased by them. Masonic influences, strange symbols, and markings. What he finds will change history. This ad down here is one that's similar to things I've seen in Minnesota a lot. The Runestone Fitness and Tanning Spa, I guess you'd call it. It shows how the runestone has entered the local economy in a big way. And I mentioned the investment that people have in these things. This was a hoax to show how easily a hoax can be accepted as real. This is the ATM stone, as it's called. There's a boulder that had a very short message carved on it. Basically, the message just basically says, Ave Maria, protect us from evil. The runestone is also known as the Bird ABM runestone. It's a hoax created in 1985 by University of Minnesota students, carving runes into a boulder near Kensington, not far from where the Kensington runestone was found in 1898. In 2001, Janie Weston, a stone carving expert, and her geologist father found the runestone, told the press that it was proof of early Viking Norse settlements in Minnesota, and began an investigation to prove its authenticity. In 2001, two of the creators, both now college professors, in fact, one at the University of Indiana, came forward with their story that it was purely a hoax and not a Viking artifact. They and some classmates at the University of Minnesota had done it as a test of how easy it was to get people to believe in mystery artifacts and just for fun. As it happened, Janie Weston sat at the same table with Scott Walter and me at the 2003 Kensington Runestone Conference at the Historical Society in Minnesota. She related the story to us and how embarrassing it was for her advocacy for the stone's validity. And it turns out Walter was also involved in the investigation, which he didn't mention at the time. Hoaxing is always unfortunate, if not downright unethical for archaeological research. But this planned hoax did make an interesting, good point about how easily people can be taken in. You suppose Scott Walter actually believes the runestone is real? This is just American Unearthed, one of the logos. Here's their runestone book with Richard Nielsen, a supposed runestone expert. And here's some of the things he did later on. As I've mentioned, when I was at the Minnesota Historical Society, I met Scott. He's a really nice, photogenic, and good guy. He invited me to his home to see his collection. His pride and joy was an autographed Rolling Stones tour jacket with the iconic Lips and Tongues Stones logo on the back. Later, he invited a colleague and me to his lab to look at the Bourne stone from Massachusetts, which is supposedly a rune stone. He also invited a renowned rune expert, Michael Barnes, to see it at the same time. My colleague and I immediately said that the marks didn't look like runes we'd seen anywhere, and that they resembled Native American petroglyphs or engravings. Barnes stayed quiet for the rest of the time. Recent work on the stone suggests that our reasoning was probably correct. I'm inclined to agree with Jason Colavito, who's a debunker of many of these fringe claims by people. He's not an archaeologist, but he's put his adult life to it, it seems like. He did a whole expose, if you'll call it that, of American Unearthed. And as you'll find out if you read his blog and his book on the series, he says that America Unearthed is full of lots of problems, data manipulation, logical errors, and sensationalism, but hardly anything resembling validity. The experts who weighed in often, Uppsala University's Henrik Williams has seen the Heavener Runestone a couple of times. When he visited in 2010, he wasn't so sure, but when he came back in Oklahoma and gave a lecture at U of Central Oklahoma in 2015, he firmed his position about it not being authentic, and I quote, "One thing I can tell you for sure, and I'm sorry to say this, but this is not a Viking runestone." The Chamber of Commerce manager at Heavener was there and disagreed and said other people have been coming to study the runestone since the 1950s and think it is from the Viking period. She said she was somewhat disappointed with the presentation and thinks Williams should continue researching the stone before he's saying it's a 19th century creation. On a 2018 post on his excellent blog site, he spelled out his logic and concluded that although no American inscription has so far been proved to be medieval or older, they constitute a particularly valuable runological research material as test cases for determining what is authentic and what is not, and how to convey the scientific results to the general public. Williams said as a scientist, he deals in probability, not possibility. When people ask him if something is genuine, he cannot give them an answer yes or no. And that is a classic truth versus validity kind of answer. Dr. Jackson Crawford, a highly respected Norse scholar associated with the University of Colorado, has a fun YouTube channel called Jackson Crawford's Old Norse channel. He looks at a wide range of topics regarding the Norse, but here he deals with the Kensington runestone and points out all the problems with Kensington. As Henrik Williams points out, he also says that there are no authentic medieval runic inscriptions known in North America. You can watch this video, just look up Jackson Crawford, Old Norse channel, and you'll find him a bunch of really good videos. About 16 minutes in, he discusses the problems with the Kensington runestone in detail, not only in terms of rune use and errors, but also logistical problems. He concludes that the Kensington runestone is 19th century forgery. He says he would actually like to find the real runestone in North America and made by the Vikings. And he also tells a funny story about a guy who offered to show him runes in a Colorado cave for a fee, which he immediately recognized were hoax. In the second video, the second half of the video, he actually does a neat thing. He examines the runes used on the stone and shows how it would look differently with the runes that would actually have been used in 1362. It would have been a very different looking runestone. So what do we know about Vikings in North America? Well, they made it to the tip of Newfoundland, up on the upper, the Great Northern Peninsula of Newfoundland, for a relatively short habitation around 1000 CE, or the Common Era, the AD, if you like. It's now recognized as a World Heritage Site, and it is pretty far north. I was there in 2018. This is what the site looks like from the air. You can see that it has three major buildings, longhouses, and see the foundation mounds from those longhouses, and a number of smaller outbuildings. There are wall outlines. There's one iron smelting forge and 4 different workshops. And it's all on this narrow terrace along the Ypres Bay, which is on the Strait of Belle Isle. The timber frame structures were constructed with a particular type of gabled roof and covered with turf taken from the surrounding peat bog. You can see the peat blocks here along the entries to it. That is me in the picture, by the way. The layout of the rooms and fireplaces and openings followed the characteristic of Norse design. It is really an interesting site to visit. I had lectured about it for years, and I'd never been there before, and it was a great thing to be able to see. I learned a lot from being there. Artifacts show clear links to the Vikings. They have a wonderful interpretive center there in the museum, and that's a picture of it. Excavation uncovered evidence of iron production at the site, as well as approximately 800 wooden, bronze, bone, and stone artifacts that confirmed the Norse origins of the property and provide important information on the work and lifestyle of the site's occupants. You can see these things here, the key artifacts. One of them is this spindle whorl, which is used for weaving, a bronze pin that was used for a cloak or something to hold things together, a whetstone used probably to sharpen bone needles, which you can see a piece of here, and this little beech shell, this beech, B-E-E-C-H, is important down the line. Regarding the iron was smelted from bog ore, which was a form of impure iron deposit that develops on plant roots in bogs or swamps. It's caused by the chemical or biochemical oxidation of iron carried in the solution of water that runs through the area. Iron smelting at Lanceau Meadows was a small scale, mostly to make iron nails. Bog iron is actually fairly easily processed. They've done a lot of experimental archaeology on doing this. Fergita Wallace's team, who came to work at the site later on, got involved in some other things. She conducted excavations along three major trenches and recovered all the botanical materials from it. In the three trenches that she dug, they found rusted nails and wood chips from ship or boat repair. The surprise was the butternut fragment, which I pointed to up here. And the reason for that is that it's so surprising is that it indicates travel much further south. Beechnut never grew on Newfoundland, and here first appears about 800 miles to the south. This doesn't mean settlements necessarily to the south, but probably at least shows some exploration for food and foraging. There are other possible Viking sites in the areas north and immediately south of Lanceau Meadows as well, but all are controversial in part because not enough excavation and analysis has been done yet. One is called the Nanook site, a name you may know from early ethnographic video films. You can see here on this corner of Baffinland. It's gotten recent attention as a possible ship repair site. The other site that's gotten recent attention is the Point Lucie site, and that's south of the site. Oh, there's the excavations at Nanook, and cauldrons, small cauldrons for smelting bronze. Here is the site, and there's the Lanceau Meadows sites. You can see some difference in place. Both of these sites have been very poorly excavated, not poorly, but not much excavation yet done, and they're very controversial. This one has some deadfalls in them, places where animals could fall into pits. They were made by Indians apparently on the island, but there's also evidence of iron smelting. And as I've said several times already, it's worth remembering that archaeologists constantly question their data and inferences from them, which means that general acceptance for these two sites will be slow in coming, just as it was for the site at Lanceau Meadows. Again, extraordinary claims demand extraordinary evidence. The logistical reasons for not accepting the North American runestone as legitimate involve mostly Viking travel patterns. The Vikings did indeed travel a lot, and you can see their sort of normal routes here. Most of them are trade routes. You will notice that almost all of them follow coastlines. You do that because that's where the people you trade with are, and that's where food sources are. It's also difficult to do some open ocean going kinds of things. You can see that they did cross the Mediterranean. They actually made their way into Eastern Europe and then into Western Asia. But they also did some open ocean stuff, and they did get to Iceland for sure, and Greenland for sure, which many do call North America, and then over to Lanceau Meadows over here. Now, remember that these things are close to the coast. Just to give you an idea of the distances involved in travel to the interior to get to contemporary Minnesota, or Oklahoma. I calculated distance using Google Earth's path measurement function, which shows there's 3 routes on here, the most commonly mentioned routes. The one that most people mention to the Kensington Runestone is this Route A, which takes you up this zone into Hudson's Bay, across Hudson's Bay, I think it's the Nelson River, and then following the lakes and rivers to the Red River of the north, and following that down to Kensington. Kensington. That's a distance of 2,727 miles roughly. Route B goes this way from Lancel Meadows down Gulf of St. Lawrence through all the Great Lakes except Lake Michigan, and then comes up through Superior, comes out around Duluth, and then takes the local river systems and lake systems down to Kensington. That one is a little bit shorter, about 2,400 miles, but it's very difficult in terms of getting through the lakes. And you might remember that there happens to be this big thing called Niagara Falls along the route. Lancel Meadows is another one that, if you think of them following coastlines, the route gets pretty long if you have to come down around the Florida Peninsula here and over to New Orleans, and then go up the Mississippi to the Arkansas to the Potomac River. That's a distance of about 4,075 miles. All of these routes, for all of them, involve substantial portages. We often think of the typical Viking ships making these. The Vikings did have smaller boats, but if you think of even these more open areas here, Viking cargo ships, which they would have taken on their open ocean runs, are about 54 feet in length average, with a beam of about 15 feet plus oars. So some have said, well, they probably just went right from Iceland. If they did that, they would have added about 1,550 miles to the one to Lancel Meadows, for example. And that's not very good. So in other words, it's very difficult to think of them as getting to the interiors. So what do I think? I found this meme that kind of fits. Vikings, seriously? Oh, come on. Is it impossible? No. Is it feasible? Well, yes, but remotely. Is there good evidence for it? No, not really any much of any at all. Archaeologist doesn't answer all the questions. It doesn't say that Vikings didn't come or could not possibly have come to the interior of North America. It just says that the evidence presented so far doesn't meet archaeological standards for validation. So, in the end, dealing with fringe ideas in archaeology requires critical thinking skills. One of the best ways for archaeologists to deal with the public that doesn't too easily accept fringe beliefs is to educate yourself about how archaeology really works, and to educate your public as well about how archaeology really works. And the basic stuff people should know about how we archaeologists think when it comes to fringe claims about archaeological past. I put these books here in this one website called Archaefantasies. This particular website is really a good one. It's got a lot of blogs, it's got video on it, it's got a number of other things. Sarah Zander, not her real name, is one of my old students from IUPUI here, and she started the whole thing. Of course, Kenneth Fader into working with her and Dr. Jeff Card. Both of them are well published in fringe archaeology. This is, in my mind, the Bible of fringe archaeology by Kenneth Fader, called Frauds, Myths, and Mysteries, and I use it in my classes, and I strongly recommend getting a look at a copy of it. It changes, it's like its 12th edition or something now, but I think you can get an earlier edition of it, pick it up for dirt cheap on Amazon or something, and you would enjoy reading it. And this is a more general one by Schick and Vaughn called How to Think About Weird Things. And this is a more classic archaeological text by Chuck Orser, but it does use a lot of fantastic archaeology examples. So that's where I'll stop, and hopefully we'll have a little bit of time left for questions. It looks like we might. Turn this thing off. Okay.
All right, so it looks like we actually have time for questions if anybody has any. There is a question, a Q&A box that people can submit anything they have.
Is my picture up? I can't tell from here.
Yep, we can see you.
Okay, good. Can you hear the yawning out in the audience?
see if anything comes in. That was great. And I actually have read your textbook and it's phenomenal. It's a great read. So.
Oh yeah. There's some good stuff out there. Archaeologists have really done a great job of trying to tell people about these things. It's just that it is so bloody hard to compete with all the stuff that's out there. As I mentioned, I started an article. You can actually, I sent the organizers here a website with a couple of my things on it, including an article I started writing about 5 years ago. And I set it aside because it got so far behind in terms of trying to keep up with all the stuff that's out there, both fringe and debunking, that I just said, well, let's let it go. And it covers some of the things I cover here tonight in terms of the general thinking about it.
Mm-hmm. Do you find any reluctance from students to accept some of this counter evidence for the claims?
Yeah, but it's interesting about that. I do a survey at the beginning of every class that I teach on this. It's a survey of general beliefs, and people have done this before, and it starts with things like do you believe in witches and ghosts and all that sort of thing. But there's also other things that forgot what I was going to say there. There's also a lot of other attitudes toward things that people have. The very first class I taught in 1975 had some pretty good students in it. One of them turned out to be somebody I crossed paths with at a Halloween costume party from in Iowa City, Iowa, when I was at the University of Iowa. A guy named Chris Shillman, who was a guy who took that class, and this was sort of in the 2000s, the early 2000s, I took that, and he introduced his wife to me. And the minute his wife heard my name, she said, "You're the reason he won't believe anything." So it does actually work. But what happens is when people start to see this stuff, it actually brings it to their attention that there are ways to assess these things. And I might say one more thing about that. That's that another study has been done about teaching classes like this. And they'll say that students go out of them being very critical thinkers. But Harold and Eve did a study in Texas following up on students 5 years after the students took their class, and found out that about 2/3 of them were back to where they were at the start of the class, because they're so overwhelmed with all this stuff coming into their lives with web and magazines and movies and everything else.
That's so interesting you said that, because we actually just got a question and someone asked if the shift from like newspapers and Daily World to social media platforms, basically if the rise of social media platforms has led to an uptick in pseudoarchaeology and more support for these fringe theories.
Oh, God, tell me the question again.
Oh, yeah, the question was essentially if the rise in social media platforms has led to kind of an uptick in pseudoarchaeology and more support for those theories.
I don't know about more support, but more use. Some of you have seen the Ancient Alien series, I assume. It's now finished its 15th season, God forbid, and it's on the History Channel, God forbid even more. But the host of that is a guy named Georgios Vikalis. If any of you have seen that, you recognize one of the reasons. Yeah, you just did it with your hands. His hair. And I asked the students, how many of you watched that? And they said, oh, we all watch it. Pretty much all of them watch it. And I said, why do you watch it? You already know it's junk science stuff. And they said, to see what Georgios' hair looks like the next time. And Vikalis is in a bunch of memes. I had some of these in an earlier version of this talk, in a bunch of memes that you can find on the web anywhere practically, in which he's there with his hands doing like I'm doing kind of here, and he's saying, it's aliens, I tell you. And it's just a whole bunch of versions of that, and you can find hundreds of them literally. That's why they were watching the show. They weren't accepting him as a font of wisdom or truth. Most of them said they would even turn it off partway through because they realized it was bogus. So there's some of that stuff out there, definitely. I didn't include this picture, but I probably could have, I should have. I treated my students once. You can see my bountiful hair. I grew it longer on the sides once, and I took one side, swooped up like that, and did it. It's a not aliens kind of meme and put it up next to Giorgio. A lot of fun with that kind of thing. But yeah, these social media sites, they all just, they overwhelm me. I just can't keep up with them. And somebody will say, oh, did you see this episode of America Unearthed or whatever? And I understand that Scott Walter, that series went down after, I think, 4 seasons, but he's got a new one, I think, coming out from what I heard. I actually respect Scott quite a bit, although he has made an industry out of it. I really like the guy. As I mentioned, a lot of fun, but just, I think now he's believing too much of his own hype.
Which happens.
I would never do that myself, of course.
Never.
No.
We had another question come in.
Sure.
Someone asked, do you think that people are reluctant to accept archaeological evidence because it doesn't align with their manifest destiny or religious beliefs?
Oh, sure. Another thing I took out of this is the timing, was that one of the things archaeologists have run into in the last 30, 40 years almost now, is that a lot of Native Americans, for example, have their own origin stories about themselves and where they came from and what their cultural movements were, and a lot of oral traditions surrounding all of that. And they often won't believe the kinds of things that archaeologists say. Some of you may be aware of a book that Brian DeLauria Jr., the Native American activist, published called Red Earth, White Lies. I can't remember the subtitle, but it's about the myth of archaeological facts. That's what it's called. And Vine and I were good friends. I had a book, he's got a paper in. He called me up when he published that book, and he said, did you read my book yet? And I said, yeah. He said, what'd you think? I said, I threw it against the wall 4 or 5 times because it sucked. So what are you talking about? I said, well, it sucked because, first of all, your sources were way out of date. I said, I'll excuse you for that because I know your library burned up. And he got other stuff and went to the library and didn't really know what he was getting. But the second thing is that he didn't understand scientific processes. Archaeologists should never challenge openly somebody's belief system. Some of these stories, these fringe beliefs, are people's origins. It's their identity. And if we say, as archaeologists, we have the truth, we're doing a great disservice not only to archaeology, but certainly to the people themselves. And that becomes a real problem for archaeologists. And in that sense, we do get people that say, oh, screw you. I had a student in one of my last Indians in North America classes. I taught Native American woman, a Native American activist, in fact. And when I started talking about the archaeology of North America, she said, oh, you're going to tell us the lies now. And I said, well, sure, but not in the way you mean it. And so yes, it's like challenging somebody really who believes that evolution didn't occur, or that we have a young Earth. It's the same kind of thing, really. You challenge those things, and it can cause issues and problems.
How do you recommend entering a conversation about these kind of topics with people? Like if they have these beliefs, you said it doesn't really do you much good to challenge them head on and be really forceful, but how might you navigate that conversation?
First of all, I try to, if I can, to get a little time to know them, what they really think about it all. And I think that's really pretty important. If you just jump in, like the one I really felt badly about that I told you about earlier was the reporter from the Sioux Falls Argus Leader who called about finding Satan's corpse. And I was just nasty, and I said to him, you know, no, you're an idiot for even asking me this about this thing. I think about that and think, I shouldn't have done that. I didn't know what his intentions were. And you need to find out perhaps a little bit better what the intentions of people are. Why are they wanting to talk about it with you? In Minnesota, in the runestone up there, you really had to be careful who you talk to about things and what they thought about it. Because there are some really dyed-in-the-wool runestone enthusiasts up there, and they don't want to. When I go to Alexandria and go into the Runestone Museum, I keep my damn mouth shut. Unless somebody knows me and wants to ask a question. Some people do. Well, it's been a while since I've been there. So that gives you an idea. You just have to be extremely cautious and never ever say, we have the truth about this stuff. We have evidence, and this is what its validity is like.
Right. No,
And
that's
I'm
okay.
challenging you.
Thank you. So still waiting. If anybody has any more questions, it looks like things are kind of winding down though. But while we wait to see if any more are coming through, I just want to say thank you again so much on behalf of OKPAN for coming out and entertaining us for this evening. This was really informative, and we appreciate you spending your time so much.
Well, I appreciate it, and I appreciate your efforts and the team you had behind the scenes that were getting things straightened out sort of at the beginning of it all. And I see Bonnie's picture up there, and I blame her for being here. So thanks, Bonnie.
She's very convincing. So.
It
was great. Thank you so much, Larry. You're wonderful. I loved your talk.
Thanks so much. I enjoy doing this kind of thing.
Okay. I think we have one more question. I have a graduate student here with me, so I'll let her.
Hi, my name is Sarah. I also work for OKPAN, and I'm teaching an intro to anthropology class right now. And so, of course, we can only spend a few weeks on archaeology, and I want at least one lecture to be about pseudoarcheology and pseudoscience. And so I'll be using that Frauds, Myths, and Mysteries book that you were just pointing out, a slightly earlier edition.
Yeah.
But I want your advice on something. In your opinion, do you think it would be more fun to use as a main example Atlantis and what Plato has to say about Atlantis and all the directions that's gone in pseudoarchaeology? Or do you think it would be more fun to discuss myths and fraud associated with Egyptian pyramids and how they were built and what they were used for? If you had to pick one or the other, what would you have the most fun with?
I think pyramids are probably the best known by everybody, so don't use it.
Oh, okay.
There's so much crap associated with that.
Okay.
I think I would use probably Atlantis, because everybody knows about Atlantis, and you've got the origin, the oral tradition kind of story behind it from Solon, the first person who might have talked about it, where Plato might have learned about it. And then you have Plato doing stuff, and you have Ignatius Donnelly in Minnesota who wrote Atlantis, the Antediluvian World, and others. And the descendant of that is actually Graham Hancock.
Yeah, that's why I brought it up. I had a student last semester who was a big fan of Graham Hancock, so that's how I learned about that.
If you can find it, there are two very good BBC videos. They're actually online now. One of them is called, I think it's called like Atlantis Reborn, and then Atlantis Reborn Again. And BBC did it, and both of them, I was involved as a sort of partial technical advisor on the first one, talking about the issues of racism that are involved in Atlantis, and any kind of thing of advanced civilizations coming and teaching the Indians everything, for example. So I'd use that one as a possibility. And then Ken Fader is in there too.
Yeah, okay, cool.
He's in the video, and he's teaching a class, and I'm not sure if you've ever heard Kenny talk, but he is really animated and really entertaining, and he is in the video as well. I think the students would kind of get off on that. And and also they might not know this, but Ted Danson, the actor, his father was a big-time archaeologist and spent a lot of his career looking for Atlantis.
Wow,
There's
interesting.
a whole video that Ted Danson's the narrator of that's about 2 hours long, but it's still there. And you could probably get a look at that and see what people have to say about that. Maybe you can assign that kind of thing, or some of the other Atlantis videos to one student or another, and have them give a report on it, kind of thing. You see what they say.
Yeah, that's smart. Thanks. I think I'll do that.
Well, good luck. I hope you enjoy it. It's kind of fun, I think, to raise that in an intro class. I always did as well, but not at the level I talked about in this one. It's kind of used to enhance the possibility of students coming into my later classes.
Thank you.
Welcome.
Okay. So I think that was probably going to be our last question.
Okay.
But again, thank you so much
You're welcome.
for your time. And oh, looks like I have somebody.
Somebody raised their hand.
Yeah, I saw a raised hand. I don't know.
Sarah Johnson. Oh, sorry, that was a mistake. It says on mine. No.
But I also, before people leave, I did want to give a quick plug that this is Oklahoma Archaeology Month, and OKPAN does have a couple more events throughout the rest over the next couple weeks. So if people are interested in learning more about that, they should visit okpan.org. And we have a calendar there under the Oklahoma Archaeology Month tab. Bonnie, did you want to?
No, I just thank you again, Larry, for a wonderful talk, and thank everybody for coming. We appreciate all of you. It was wonderful.
Good to see everybody. Thanks for coming, everybody. I will leave. Bye-bye.